Thank you for being here. It's truly our pleasure to host a partnership for New York, which represents the city's largest private sector employers and really the city's business leaders. You represent over 7 million employees and over $1 trillion to the U.S. economy, which is truly staggering. Even more importantly, your group is based around working with all levels of government to ensure that there's a strong economic platform for the U.S. economy. And that's in perfect keeping with this administration's desire and goal to bring in the very best minds and the very best thought leaders and the very best from the private sector that we possibly can, and engage in a great dialogue and conversation and use those ideas to inform our policies. So we look forward to a great conversation today, but thank you for being here. We're going to start our discussion. We have multiple panels today on infrastructure. Obviously, it's a topic that has captured a lot of imagination across the country. It will represent, at the end of the day, over $1 trillion of new investment into rebuilding America and to creating transformative projects that otherwise might not get accomplished. And we're very pleased today to be represented by head of the National Economic Council, Director of National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, and Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Chow. I'd also like to acknowledge Stephen Roth, who's here today, who will co-chair, along with Richard Lafrac, the President's Infrastructure Task Force. So Gary, without further ado, let me start with you. The President has tasked you with this enormous undertaking. He wants you to rethink how we think about infrastructure to rebuild our country. How are you approaching this? What are your priorities? How are we going to get it done?
How long do we have?
Right, go.
I feel uncomfortable. I'm used to sitting out there in that side of this room with this crowd. So
No question.
Thank you all for being here today. Look, it's a huge task. And when you think about infrastructure, it's an enormously broad topic. And framing what the topic is very hard in itself. And we have taken the broadest interpretation of infrastructure. So, we are not limiting ourselves to what you would say is the conventional infrastructure of roads, ports, highways, airports. We're going all the way from cyber, all the way through everything that you can look at in any part of your daily life that really is the backbone of how you live your life in the first derivative or the second derivative or the third derivative. We consider that all to be part of infrastructure. Infrastructure touches 16 governmental agencies, which is interesting. We got all 16 governmental agencies together. We sat down as a group in this building a few weeks ago, and we said, look, we've got to really attack this problem in a new and different way. Instead of 16 different agencies looking at infrastructure problems, let's do it together. Let's all work cooperatively. Let's come up with our ideas. Let's put our ideas on one sheet of paper, and let's optimize our ideas, which is, little for you sitting out there, it doesn't sound like a unique idea. It's a pretty unique idea in Washington that instead of having each agency go out and look at their best idea, that we take all of the best ideas in the government and we optimize them and we prioritize them. We're prioritizing them on a scale that not only looks at return on investment, and return on investment is very important for us, but it looks for a return on investment in the economy, not just return on investment on the capital. What does this do for the economy? How does it create jobs? How does it make us more competitive in the world? How does it change our position in the world? And that's very important for us when we're looking at infrastructure. So like I said, it's expansive, it's broad, it's how does it create jobs? How does it help the economy grow? How do we change the lives of Americans every day? Now, when we say that, there's an enormous amount of work because infrastructure is hugely fragmented in the United States. It's the other point you'll learn when you get to infrastructure. The federal government doesn't own that much infrastructure. We are less than 10% of the infrastructure is actually owned by the federal government. And it whittles all the way down. You've got federal government, you've got state infrastructure, you've got city, you've got county, and you've got authorities. Like a lot of you from New York, you've got Tri-Borough Authority, you've got Bridge and Tunnel Authority, you've got all the different authorities that you're uniquely aware of. And we've got to get all the way down into the authorities and figure out how to work with the different authorities. So we're taking a very expansive role, and we're trying to figure out how to work with everyone in the food chain.
Okay. Secretary Chow, you have experience at the highest levels of government and throughout government. The Department of Transportation has a huge imprint on the nation's infrastructure. What role do you see yourself playing and the DOT playing in the infrastructure package? What are your priorities? What do you want to get accomplished?
Number one, I follow Gary Cohn.
We all do.
I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm glad that you are here as well. You are all celebrities in this town called Washington. And I want to give a big shout out to Steve Schwartzman for chairing this event, this whole delegation, and then for all of you to come and spend some time sharing with us your point of view, and also going up on the Hill and talking to leaders of the Congress. Because again, you're all CEOs, you're all very well known, you are like celebrities. And members of Congress like to see you. So it's great that you are here. And with that, I want to do a second shout out, and that's to Kevin McCarthy, the majority leader of the United States House of Representatives. Kevin, oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Gosh, you missed my best lines. A shout out to Steve Schwartzman, a shout out to Gary Cohn. And
You're really good at this, aren't you?
I'm going to get to the substance, and this is really important. And then Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy is here. He's extraordinarily busy, but he has been instrumental in outreach to Silicon Valley, and I've been a beneficiary of that. And he's also been such an incredible force in reaching out to the for-profit corporate sector as well. So Leader McCarthy, we want to thank you so much for sparing the time to be here with us today. Really appreciate it. The president is really to be applauded and supported because he has taken on a huge issue that most Americans know that there's a problem, because every single one of us, most of us, travel in some way on roads, bridges, sometimes go to the ports, deal with energy and deal with broadband. Americans know that our infrastructure is weakening, in some cases deteriorating, and in other cases just plain broken. And the president, once again, is able to break through the clutter, take on this very important issue, and connect with the American people. So he has put forward this bold program initiative where we hope to have $1 trillion over 10 years to improve the connectivity of our infrastructure. And so Reed, who we're very glad is here as well, because Reed does a great job, and his father is here. You got to introduce your father. Where's your father?
David Cordish.
Right next to his wife.
David.
Former government
Cordish.
Employee, right?
So his father is here, and Reed does a wonderful job. And we're talking about really important issues. And Gary was saying how fragmented our infrastructure is. So I have a great, kind of a joke. The president and I had a conversation like in November. I was so honored to see him at Trump Tower. And I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and I had to see him the next day. Do you know how hard it is to get from Louisville, Kentucky to New York City in time for that appointment? But I was there. But he said, "You don't know anything about construction." And I said, "Mr. President, you are right. I don't know very much about construction." But going back to Reed's question about experience, but I said, and Gary's point, the Department of Transportation has a budget of $70 billion. And we don't build anything. All that money comes from you, the taxpayer, comes to the Department of Transportation through gasoline taxes primarily, and then we send it in a block grant according to a formula decided by the United States Senate and the Congress on how it's to be spent. So a lot of the infrastructure in our country, as Gary mentioned, is extraordinarily decentralized. So this money comes to me, our department, Department of Transportation. I give it to the states give it to the various localities and municipalities, and they actually decide what the priorities are. So as we think about infrastructure, we need to understand the current governance structure in which money flows down to the various states and localities, and how do we impact that? And one of the things that I get told a lot is that money is not the problem. You know, there's lots of money chasing too few deals. And so what we need to do is somehow work on the upstream part of rebuilding our infrastructure, and that is to let loose the permitting process so that deregulatory efforts can be ongoing. And there are many famous construction real estate magnates in this room who would understand what I'm talking about, because the amount of time that it takes to build a bridge, 16 years, you know, a road, about 16 years.
Yeah.
It is an incredibly long time. So how do we build a consensus to decrease that permitting process so that more projects can be available, so that the risk profile is decreased for investors? And that is one of our emphasis at the Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. To the Secretary's point, the average length of time for a permitting process for a large-scale infrastructure project exceeds 8 years. And there's tremendous uncertainty during that time. Many projects drop out or don't even start the process. So far more important than the projects we will create and build as a part of this infrastructure package is fixing the permitting process to allow for the private sector to truly create massive infrastructure investment in this country. Gary, the President has prioritized that this not only be immediate projects, but this also be transformative projects, projects that might not otherwise get done by the private sector, projects that lift the American spirit and unleash GDP growth. I know you focused on one such project being potentially air traffic control reform. I'd love to hear about that and potentially other transformative projects.
So, is that me? So Reed, thanks. So let me touch on air traffic control quickly, and then I'll touch on the other projects. So look, air traffic control to me is probably the single most exciting thing we can do for a lot of reasons. Number one, everyone else has done it, so we know it's relatively easy to do, which is kind of insulting that we're the last to do air traffic control, not the first to do air traffic control. A country that has Silicon Valley and all of the technology entrepreneurs that we have, we're playing catch up. That's embarrassing for us. We've lost controls of the skies over the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean to Canada because Canada has adapted a GPS-based air traffic control system 10 years or 20 years before we did in the United States, and pilots would much prefer to use a GPS versus a land-based radar system. We have a land-based radar system in the United States. We have not upgraded to a GPS system in the United States. Number two, it affects every state in the country multiple times. We have multiple air traffic control systems in multiple states all over the country. So this is a project that touches every part of the country. Number three, everyone in the country is affected, whether you fly or not. If you fly, we are going to cut flight times down fairly dramatically. We're going to cut the experience down. We're going to cut tarmac time down. We're going to go direct from point to point. For those of you that live in New York, which is almost all of you, I know you have noticed that when you fly from Boston to New York, you fly farther west than you fly far south. You literally fly west to fly south. When you go to GPS air traffic control, you can fly from point to point. And then you don't, and the way we fly now is we fly at certain elevations. Your plane will drop from 20,000 to 15,000 to 10,000. With GPS, you do continuous descent and continuous rise. What does that mean? It means that we'll save over 25% of the jet fuel that we consume in this country. If you save 25% of the jet fuel you consume in this country, we'll consume less oil. It means consumers will pay less for oil no matter where they consume it. If they consume it as gasoline, they consume it as home heating oil. It doesn't matter, consumers win. This is a project that is so interesting and so enticing, the unions support doing it. That tells you something. The unions are supporting doing it. There's only 2 potential points of opposition for us right now, and we've worked through everything but 2 potential points of opposition. And you guys can help us with one. General aviation may be against it, which is all your private airplanes. You may be against it because you're afraid of a tax that we may put on, but we're probably not even going to tax general aviation. There's enough money in the aviation tax right now. And number 2, my friend Mr. McCarthy over there is going to help me with number 2. It's the appropriators in Congress, because as Secretary Chow said, she collects gas tax and then redistributes it. The appropriators collect the aviation tax and then they redistribute it. It's a zero-sum game, but they like that $40 billion or $50 billion a year flowing through their hands. And if we actually privatize air traffic control, they won't be able to touch the money. Even though they really can't do much with it, they take it in and they redistribute it. So everyone else in the system is going to be happy with this. Every other country has basically done it, and we've got to catch up, and it's a great win. On more interesting topics, this is where sort of the U.S. entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well. We can do the U.S. power grid. And the U.S. power grid is fascinating. The U.S. power grid, like the air traffic control system, was done in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We have an old, antiquated power grid. We lose 20% of the electrons that we put into the power grid. As you move power across our grid, 20% of the electrons disappear. If you could capture those 20%, any one of you can tell me there's a 5-year repayment, okay? There's new technology that if you run wires in opposite directions and create a magnetic field, you capture 100% of those electrons. Any one of you will make that investment that has a 5-year repayment and you own the wires forever. We can do that. It's a huge mega processing business, and you've got to get enormous approvals to go through 50 states. That one's interesting. And then you take someone like Elon Musk, who thinks that we should have battery stations all over the country. We should have 50 battery stations in the country, and we should dump power into the battery stations during the middle of the night when it's cheap to generate power, and draw power out of them in the middle of the afternoon when power prices peak. He thinks we can rebalance the whole power grid in the United States and lower power costs dramatically. Elon also thinks we can tunnel the entire United States. We can't really build high-speed rail in the East Coast corridor because it's too curvy. The track's just too curvy. So if you look at the Acela train today, everyone says, you know, you go to China, you go to Japan, we've got all this high-speed rail. If you literally did high-speed rail between New York and Washington, D.C., you could get high-speed rail down to an hour trip. We can't do high-speed rail because there's too many curves in the tracks. The train couldn't go fast enough. So you have 2 problems. Either you could eminent domain and take away a lot of houses and a lot of businesses and go straight. We don't think that's going to happen. Elon Musk says, okay, I can solve the problem. I can tunnel the whole way. And he's actually been tunneling out in the desert. He's been tunneling in California to prove it can get done. And not only can he tunnel, he can beat high-speed rail. He'll put you in a pneumatic tube, and it'll get you from Washington to New York in substantially less than an hour. Another technology he's working on. So we don't have a lack of ingenuity. We have a lack of desire to really figure out what to do. Now, that brings in this whole question.
Gary, I'm going to cut you off.
Okay.
I apologize.
Okay.
Secretary Chow, anything to add?
You can cut me off.
Well, he was actually doing very well.
He was doing great. But
No, you finish. You finish.
So it's really
You're my most important secretary.
Oh, you say that to everyone.
because then we want to hear from the CEO. So.
Yes, please. The really interesting part, that we are dealing with such interesting people. I mean, Elon Musk doesn't believe in flying cars. I mean, he's thinking that far ahead. Please.
Okay. I want to turn over to the CEOs to hear from you. So Michael Corbett, if you could please.
Reed, thank you. And
Thank you.
Secretary Chow, Gary, thank you for taking time. From the Partnership of New York's perspective, obviously infrastructure is right at the top of our list in terms of things that we think are meaningful. Representing a city of approximately 8.5 million people, 4.5 million jobs, 740 billion of GDP growing at approaching 3%. Clearly constraints in the future largely point towards infrastructure. And if we look at the city today, a lot of the expansion and a lot of that growth that's gone on has been outside the traditional transportation channels. Second challenge today in infrastructure in the city is that there's a lot of things that need to be done that, not a technical term, but aren't necessarily sexy. Some of the studies have said we've got about what we in business would equate to about $45 billion of deferred capital expenditure that's not necessarily new projects, but it's necessary investment and maintenance back into projects for the maintenance, sustenance, and the ability to grow the city. And Secretary Chow, I think as you said, and I think the room would concur, there's not necessarily a lack of capital for these projects, but there's a lack of ability to bring together approval processes to define what are truly financeable revenues, to get in place subsidiaries, loan guarantees, to get tax advantage financing. So as the administration thinks about its plan, are you working down to the local level and thinking at the local level of how you can impact these where most of these things actually need to occur?
You know, government is not easy. It's not easy. And it's very consensus-oriented. It's not unilateral. So that is an excellent question. And there are organs in place where such discussions are occurring, but building consensus take a great deal of time. We don't have that time. We understand that. That's why we needed to have this interagency workforce. As Gary mentioned, there are about, I thought there were 8 or 9. You said 9 or 10 or 11, 12 different agencies, departments around this infrastructure initiative. There is Treasury. Steve Mnuchin needs to be at the table because he decides what the top line is. We need the OMB director there because the OMB director is going to decide how the money's going to be spent. Wilbur Ross needs to be there because he's with the Commerce Department. We need EPA, Energy, FCC with broadband, and Environmental Protection Agency. And so we all have to work together and exert an influence and use incentives downward on all of this. But that's where presidential leadership is very important. And the Department of Defense is involved. Guess why? Because the Army Corps of Engineers is involved in huge amounts of construction on land and on the seas and the ports. That's so essential to infrastructure. So the short answer to your question is yes, we're very much aware of the need for engagement at the local level. And we have to do it through a public-private partnership where, once again, your delegation, your efforts in New York will be very, very essential in working with us to influence and help motivate the right kinds of productive movement toward the President's infrastructure initiative. Thank you.
Deanne?
Secretary Chow and Director Cohn, thank you for being with us today. My question is a little more specific to New York City. As you know, Superstorm Sandy did a lot of damage to the city, and my company, Guardian Life, was displaced from our building for about 9 months, as were many other companies in Lower Manhattan. Not because of damages to our building, which were easily repaired, but because of the infrastructure damage caused by the storm to the old infrastructure under the street. And the storm also damaged the tunnel under the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York. Mm-hmm. And as you know, if you're from New York, that tunnel is now sometimes not very reliable. And it cost my company $40,000 an hour when that tunnel is down. It cost New York City employers about $6 million an hour for that tunnel to be down. Replacing it is going to be one of those very large projects that requires a lot of cooperation, as you were just suggesting. So my question is, what kind of support can we get for infrastructure projects in New York City, like the tunnel and like the hardening of the coastlines that's going to prevent all of our businesses from being disrupted in another storm?
I'm very much aware of the project that you were talking about. I have basically one designee on that authority board. And again, that goes back to the decentralized nature of infrastructure. So as we're working on a legislative package, and that will be probably in May or late May or something like that, we're very much aware of the need for legislation, but we also need to deal with some of the corporate governance. I'm not suggesting that we change it, but that is where citizen action is really, really important, because you would have influences with the governors of both states, New York and New Jersey, and also the Port Authority that is also involved in that. So I don't have a good answer for you, but it is a priority, and we are trying to work on that.
Thank you, Secretary, for making that a priority.
We'll do unfortunately, our final question, Dan Tishman.
Sure, thank you, Reed. I just want to make one brief comment, and that's that it's great to hear that this administration is trying to unleash about $1 trillion worth of opportunity and to heal our infrastructure. We all know that $1 trillion is just a drop in the bucket, and the great opportunity is to take that money, leverage it against billions and billions of dollars of private investment, which is sitting on the line. I think there are a couple of ways to do that. I've heard comments about permitting and unleashing and making that streamlined. I think that's extraordinarily important. But there's another piece. There still are states that at the policy level, at the political level, do not allow the unleashing of private sector dollars into public sector projects. There are also federal agencies that do not allow private sector investment in federal. And I think finding a way to leverage the federal dollars in a way that mandates or allows us to change those policies, you have to get through the policy level before you can get to the permitting level. There are a few programs that really work well. I would really encourage, as you draft the current infrastructure program, that you look at the programs relative to public activity bonds and to the TIFIA program, which have worked well. They've leveraged, I think they've deployed a lot of federal capital. And then there's a program that was extraordinarily positive in the past, administered by my good friend David, and that was a program called UDAG, which was probably the first federal program which leveraged federal dollars against private sector investment, but mandated that the private sector investment was committed to in advance of even applying for the federal dollars. I think that type of a program should be really investigated and should be used. That was mostly for housing and urban redevelopment, but there's no reason why it couldn't be deployed across the vast spectrum. It would give the federal government certainty that there were private dollars available for the projects in advance of making their federal commitment.
So Dan, we agree with everything you just said. Now I know why Reed's fighting for that program itself. So you've actually made something very transparent to me. But no, we agree with everything you're saying, and I'm going to tie together what the Secretary Chow just said, and all of your questions sort of hang together on this whole issue of capital and maintenance and permitting and getting projects done and who should do them. We have spent the first 70 plus days trying to figure out how to prioritize projects, what projects to do, who owns them, how to get them built, and how to maintain them. You know, you've got the Washington subway experiment here where you build a great subway, and I was in college when it opened. It was a great subway, and then they forgot to maintain it. And so we talk about all these issues all day long. A lot of these discussions lead us to one place. They lead us to public-private partnerships, where you literally bring third-party capital, third-party board, third-party ownership in, where investors and some investment manager having a fiduciary responsibility, having to maintain the asset to make sure the capital gets the rate of return it was told it would get, maintains the asset for the duration of the asset, whether it be 20, 30, or 40 years. And we think that is a big, huge step forward. Again, like air traffic control, we're not on the cutting edge of this. And we've got to get a little bit more comfortable with public-private partnership. There was a great not an experiment because it was done in Australia, where the Australians said instead of just giving out capital to cities and states and municipalities, we're going to reward our local governments by anything that they sell and everything that they privatize, we're going to give them federal money based on how much they privatize. That's something that we look at here. Instead of people in cities and states and municipalities coming to us and say, hey, please give us money to build a project, and not knowing if it will get maintained and not knowing if it will get built, we say, hey, take a project you have right now, sell it off, privatize it, we know it will get maintained, and we'll reward you for privatizing it, and then go out and keep doing that. And the bigger the thing you privatize, the more money we'll give you. So very interesting. If you're interested, look at what Australia did. It's quite interesting. So we are talking about all the topics that the three you talked about. They do link together of how you build, how you maintain, and how you keep them, sort of cutting edge for long duration, because all of these are infinite duration assets.
Secretary Chow?
Your point about public-private partnerships and the flexibility and the potential that it has in being disallowed in certain, in many places is an absolutely key one, and I didn't mention that, and you're absolutely right.
Gary Cohen, Secretary Chow, thank you very much.
Thank you, Reed.
Appreciate it.
Reed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Great job. Thank you. Do you want to use this? Yeah, you can use it. Keep moving. We'll only be so far, behind schedule. Our second topic is modernizing government services, particularly modernizing government IT would not only save the taxpayers billions of dollars per year, but would allow for a more efficient government and a much more secure government. I'd like to thank House Leader McCarthy, Assistant to the President Chris Slidell, for being here. Chris and Leader McCarthy, what does it mean to you? What does modernizing government services mean to you? What is your vision for it?
My vision is to have government as innovative as Google, customer-centric as Apple, and as quick as Amazon. Now, that's the vision to be able to get there. So when I was in graduate school, we always had to do SWOT analysis, right? Strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. What is our strength to make this happen? Our greatest strength is our president. We got a disruptor. If anybody else was sitting in that job, you'd get status quo to continue further. They'd talk about it, but they couldn't get it done. So one, we've got a great ability to make this happen because of our president. Secondly, we created something in Congress called the Innovation Initiative. We just had it last year. I created it with Patrick McHenry. We moved 35 bills last year. It takes 218 votes to pass a bill. You know what our average vote on our bills were? 366. We didn't start to say, let's make a bipartisan bill. We just started with a problem, and because the solution was so good, it became bipartisan. 9 of them became law already. One was the Talent Act, so something that I authored. Don't expect us to know what needs to happen. We need to get the right talent into government, those in the Silicon Valley. The Talent Act allows that to happen, the fellowship program, to bring people in from the inside. Now, weaknesses. We spend $80 billion a year on IT. 80% of that goes to legacy programs. Take the VA. In the last 10 years, the VA has gone from a $79 billion budget to $176 billion. But you know what their benefit delivery network uses? Cobalt. A 1951 software. They doubled their amount they have received, and they still have not changed a simple software system. Would Amazon survive, or anybody else, or any of you? So what we have to do is we have to think of this differently. I think we have a capability of making that happen, getting the right people in, having someone that's willing to push it and make it happen. But we also have proven that in a world of partisanship, there's something that unites us, something that makes government more efficient, more effective, and more accountable. So to me, at the end of the day, there are a lot of opportunities out there. And I'm thankful that we have an administration that understands that.
Yeah, so very similar. So 3 components from my perspective. Firstly, world-class citizen services. The government does incredibly important things, but it actually does relatively simple things, certainly from a technology point of view. So you should have the same positive emotional experience dealing with the government as you have with the private sector when it comes to technology. So think FedEx, think Amazon, think anything that does a large number of transactions in a simple fashion. So that's number one, first and foremost. Number two is a great world-class analytics platform. So you can't run the government efficiently if you don't have the data to actually do it with. So having a external-facing platform, but also an internal-facing platform, so people who work inside the government can run it in the most effective and efficient fashion. And third is cyber. Cyber security is, first and foremost, we need a secure platform from an external point of view and an internal point of view. If I can put a fourth, it's obviously cost. As the leader said, we spend $86 billion a year. To put that in perspective, there's around 2 million federal employees, non-military. That's about $43,000 a person. So those of you who work in the private sector can think of the metrics you use on a per-person basis. It would be great to spend that money if we spent it well, but the reality is we have very poor services for the money we spend. So whether we save that money or reinvest it in better services doesn't matter. There's a huge economic opportunity as well.
So you both seem to have a fairly common vision for what it could be, and that's kind of rare in DC. Why hasn't it happened before then? It seems so logical, common sense. Why hasn't it happened? How does Congress and the White House have to work together to make it happen?
I believe yes. We need a leader in the White House, which we have now. He has to be able to disrupt because you're going to make people uncomfortable. You're going to take power away from certain people, but you're going to create more efficiencies. I sat in a committee one time, and I listened to people. They happened to be on the other side of the aisle, and they were upset that if we modernize, people would lose their job. Instead of people would get better jobs in the process. They were opposed to ATMs. They were opposed to self-checkout because they thought that took jobs away. And the quote was, the great thing about government is we don't modernize, so we guarantee that people can continue in these jobs. The uniqueness is we're working on the Modernizing Government Technology Act. And it's not one side of the aisle. You know who's authoring this? Will Hurd, Steny Hoyer, and myself. So I've got the minority whip, a very bright sophomore that was a former CIA agent and had his own technology company, on how we're going through with each department and changing how we use technology and getting rid of the legacy programs. But we would never be successful if we don't have the administration tied with us because they're running agencies. So the more that we interlink together, which is, it's been a breath of fresh air. With this new administration. I can't say enough about it.
To me, I spent most of the first 60 days here just talking to people and finding out what had happened before. And the interesting thing from my perspective is virtually 100% alignment on the what we need, virtually no alignment on the how to do it. So people know exactly what we need, but the difficulty has been getting over the inertia of the multiple parties are involved and the difficulty of getting this done. And the reality is this is hard stuff. This is hard, grindy, unexciting, hard work. And also, it's probably going to pay off in future administrations more than the current one. So it isn't always at the top of the political agenda. But we have a president who's actually willing to invest not only for this administration, but for future administrations. And I think that's been a big difference, that we're willing to take a 4+ year approach and actually do the hard work involved. And the alignment I've found certainly has been huge. So I think the how is now, I'm much more optimistic than I was coming in a few weeks ago.
And you think of the last panel, this is infrastructure.
Yeah.
If we get the foundation right, everything else is going to flow much easier.
No question about it. Let's turn over to the CEOs and here. So Ajay?
Sure, and thank you for addressing the idea. Kevin, I won't take it personally. You didn't mention MasterCard when you talked of innovation. I'll just take that
That's
card
the
away from your
accountability
wallet. But my question's in cybersecurity and infrastructure. You just made the point that they're interconnected. You know, everybody talks about the Internet of Things. We talk about devices. We talk about the data. We talk about the great value all that brings to the party. And there's no doubt it does. But the problem is that along with that comes all the risks that a lot of people aren't aware of. One, because consumers tend to prefer functionality over security, and we make that a choice they have to take, which we shouldn't, but we do. And second, because the weakest links tend to be gullible. And the weakest link tends to be both the consumer but also small businesses. Small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and Kevin, you were a small businessman, you understand this really well. were attacked more often than others. And when they get attacked, they get shut down more often than others. So when you put all that together, my sense is there's a series of things that can be done in the relatively short term in cyber, be it from public-private partnerships to the kind of act that Congress passed, did, I think, 70% of the way to get us to get the right level of information sharing, but take that forward to liability sharing as well. And then from there to global rules and globally consistent rules to all the things we could do in the future with workforce development and with the right things around biometrics. And there's a series of things that can be done to make the Internet of Things safer and more valuable for our future. I think everybody gets that. The what and the how are clearer. I'm not sure what the structure will be to get this to work better. I'm not sure what the structure and the appetite is from both Congress and the administration to make something happen in the relatively short term. And I'd love to hear your views on that topic.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your help on this. And you're right. We did move legislation last Congress, and it did get us 70% of the way there. And the interesting part of it, it was just foundation. It was getting us to be able to communicate together and share information without a fear of being sued. So that's a strong foundation. I want to give the administration credit. They're going through an executive order, and they just didn't throw one out there just for speed. They're working it through to make sure you get it right. This is an area that I think we have to continually to look at. How fast technology moves. We create as much data in 2 days as we do from the beginning of time into 2006. So when you're dealing with old legacy programs, they are ripe for individuals when it comes through. When you're dealing with a small business, you're the ones on the low end that's going to be attacked first and have the biggest effect on that can put you out. So we've got to think in that mindset. Now that we've got the foundation right, we look at where the executive order comes through, get that right, and then we need to readdress. This is something I think from a legislative point of view, we should modernize almost every single year to keep up with technology instead of waiting decades to be able to readdress it.
Yeah, from my point of view, the government needs to totally rethink the way in which it implements technology. So our traditional approach has been these big, monolithic, multi-year projects, which by the time they're finished, they're out of date, certainly from a cybersecurity point of view. The whole world is moving towards much more continuous innovation, and we need to rethink the way that we implement technology along those lines. So we need to move not only to a more cloud-based, but a more continuous updating. And we need to access the private sector way more than we have in the past. I mean, the billions and billions of dollars that spent in the cybersecurity space in the private sector are vastly more powerful and numerous than anything we can do internally. So we need to mentally shift from we can solve these problems to how do we get the best services from the private sector to fight cybersecurity. That's going to take multiple years to do, but it's a change in mindset and it's incredibly important. But it's consistent with the other things we're doing as well, which is having better citizen services. Again, continuous improvement rather than big multi-year projects has got to be the way of the future.
And by putting in place the right infrastructure, we can actually create a marketplace that opens up government to smaller companies. Right now, they have really no ability to interact with government. Similar to what the UK just accomplished, we can introduce it to much smaller, more nimble companies.
And we shouldn't underestimate the sharing, because what happens is a lot of these attacks are similar, but somebody sees it, somebody fights it, but they were fearful for telling anybody else for a lawsuit. The best place is to help with those small ones when we find out what the attack is, how do you solve it, advising everybody else.
Robert?
Great, thank you. I guess to continue on the themes, it seems like lots of things are rhyming here. When we imagine the services and activities of government, and if we want to make them more efficient, it seems to me they fall into three categories, if I may. One is things government needs to do, but they need to do better. Two are things government can do with partners, whether NGOs or private sector. And the third are some things that should be shifted completely off the government activity into the private sector. Have you thought about mapping things into these three types of areas and maybe foreshadow for us how this might unfold once you built the framework of infrastructure and process to deal with these things?
We've looked in the Innovation Initiative in so many areas this way. And to me, it's more about freedom. With technology change, you're able to have the data to be able to see it. I mean, I'll give you one prime example of why data collection and things you don't even think about. Before you all came here, you probably looked on your weather app, right? To see what the weather's going to be like. You know how that weather app was created? It's during the Reagan term where he had all this data being collected by satellites that government was just keeping. Never thought there would be an app be able to create it by it, but he said, why don't we release this information? And lo and behold, the private sector found something for it, provided consumers something much better and more accuracy. Government has so much of this that we've never, ever looked at or thought at. If we release this out into the private sector, they will be able to solve something faster, grab something that provides a consumer better, but be more accountable and more efficient. That's what we want out of government. We want something that's efficient, accountable to individuals.
Yeah, we launched something last week called the Office of American Innovation, and it's led by Jared Kushner. And one of the mandates for that is to take totally new approaches to old problems. And this is a totally new approach, an old problem that needs a totally new approach. So absolutely we need to think of those three areas. And what Jared's done is empowered us to say, throw away the old rule book. When you approach these problems, take whatever you think is the most sensible approach going forward. And clearly that involves getting the best and brightest ideas from the private sector. Whether we use those ideas in terms of paying for them, get those ideas and implement them. So don't think that the government can solve all of these problems. Think about how we import the best ideas, whether it's academics, the philanthropic sector, the private sector, whatever. Take a fundamentally different approach. So yes, your three categories are exactly how we're thinking about it.
But a way to build on this, what we just did with the Talent Act. If we use the same government people that have worked there for decades and you think you're going to get a different outcome, you're not. The Talent Act allows those that have never been in government, never dreamed of being in government, and not going to give a career to government, but is willing to come in for a year, and they're in the private sector. They're into technology, and they come in and they're fresh eyes, and they look at something and say, why are you doing it this way? Here's a different flow chart that can make this more efficient and effective. That's what we need, and I'm telling you, from Jared's office and others, that's what we're getting in the process. Now, it's my responsibility to just try to find if 218, but we've proven that on average we're getting 366. And it's a much better way to go about solving a problem because people see it's more efficient.
Steve?
I think everybody is on board of the notion of overhauling the government's technology. Obviously, we're all doing it in our own businesses. We also know the benefits, but we also know how complicated it can be, how these projects can get off the rails. Just even thinking about all of the projects that one might undertake to overhaul the vast federal government's technology is mind-boggling. So can you give us some more tangible sense of what is either the low-hanging fruit, some of the first projects, or perhaps asked another way, what would success look like at the end of this first four-year term?
And Chris, answer it really quickly.
Yeah, sure. So this is going to be multiple years. This is not going to be easy. This is going to be hard work, so it's not going to be exciting. In terms of short-term wins, I think in the purchasing area, that's a huge one. That's something we can do relatively quickly. We buy not only in the IT sense, but just about everything. We're the biggest buyer in the country of just about everything that we do buy, and we don't use economies of scale. That's the first thing that any private sector organization would look like. Massive opportunity, relatively easy from a technology point of view. So that would be one thing. The other thing would be killing all the regulations. The last administration put a huge number of regulations in terms of what agencies need to do to comply with the various IT things that they do. All of those have inhibited progress. If we do the same approach that we're taking with everything else in government and take away some of those regulations, we will actually allow agencies to do their business without any central control vastly better. Those two things relatively quickly.
Two successes that I would look for. Modernizing Government Technology Act, because when it goes into every agency, provides them the resources for their technology individual to actually do something different. Secondly would be the VA. If there's any place, when the VA was created, it was in 1920. We had fans to cool us down. We had radios to get our news. And the VA would write it down on paper if they had a disability claim. Today we have central air, we have our phones for our news, and the VA writes it down on paper for disability claim. So if there's one place that could unite everybody to fundamentally make a change, and there's one place where technology can provide somebody, think about it. Some of you took Uber, you found a car to get here, you could rate the individual and they could rate you. Why couldn't a veteran simply do that by making an appointment rating their doctor and the doctor providing their information. That's happening out there. We should be able to provide it to our own veterans.
We've got the right secretary and Secretary Shulkin to get us there. Leader McCarthy, Chris Liddell, thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you so much.
I'll provide that to the next.
I'm okay, I've got
Okay. So our next panel is on workforce development. The administration's policies are without question going to bring back hundreds of thousands and are bringing back hundreds of thousands of skilled manufacturing and technology jobs. It's imperative that we invest in building a skilled workforce to meet those demands. It's my pleasure to be joined by Ivanka Trump, Assistant to the President and First Daughter, I believe is the official title, Secretary Ross, Secretary of Commerce, and Dina Powell, Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. Thank you for joining us. I'll start with Ivanka. So workforce is a topic that impacts people in various stages of their education and work life. How will the administration look at this holistically?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to break it down into multiple elements. So when you think about the broader concept of workforce development, you think about K through 12 and ensuring the kids graduating and coming out of our school system are equipped with the skills that are necessary in the modern workforce. And especially in STEM fields, for example, we see that the students are not ready and are not able and are not prepared either for higher education in a lot of cases or to enter the workforce in a meaningful way. So education is very core. The second area we're looking at is the role of vocational education, in particular apprenticeships. And we actually just had a very robust discussion with the Chancellor of Germany when she was in town just a few weeks ago, because the Germans have really led the way on this front. The Swiss have done a great job with it more recently. In England, we've seen a lot of focus on apprenticeship training. So really thinking about the role of vocational education and making sure that it is incentivized for both the students to consider it as a viable option and partnering with the private sector to really ensure that what's happening, the education taking place, whether it's at community college or at apprenticeship programs, matches ultimately their needs. So skill-based education. The last thing we're looking at is workforce retraining. So for people who have been out of the workforce for a number of years and are looking to re-enter, or people who are currently in the workforce, but they're in a field where jobs are rapidly being displaced. So how do we take large groups of people and think about how to retrain them in areas where their skills will be more relevant to the workforce of the future. So it's a big topic. There's tens of billions of dollars that are allocated across over 14 agencies on this topic. So another area similar to what we were talking about with infrastructure is really taking a look at all the programs that are out there, consolidating those programs and working collectively. We had a meeting last week where we had the Secretary of Education, Wilbur, we had the Secretary
Mick Mulvaney was there.
Mick Mulvaney was there, really thinking about how we can ensure that everyone's working collectively with these goals in mind.
Great, thank you. Secretary Ross, are there ways to incentivize the private sector to further their investment in workforce training? Many of them have taken a leadership role on this already.
Yes, the big corporations seem to be finding a pretty good way to do it. If you have a large number of employment needs in given locations. You can partner with local community college, with even some of the high schools to accomplish the purpose. What's harder is to get the small business who has very limited needs to be able to do it. So we've been focusing some on delivery mechanisms, and one of the ones I'm kind of intrigued with is integrating technology into the delivery mechanism. You have licensing problems at schools, you have all kinds of things of that sort. So I think combining the human instructor element with internet delivered service in education is a very important thing. Specifically for the small businesses, we're looking at programs whereby they can both get an assurance of retention through a kind of loan program to the students, with the idea being they would gradually forgive those loans as the student stays on with the employer, maybe over a 5-year period, and trying to match that with tax deductibility to the corporation, but hopefully not taxable income to the student as the loans are forgiven, and couple that perhaps with some loans from the Small Business Association, Small Business Administration, to the little companies, backed by the combination of the company's credit and the loans that they had made to the students on some realistic loan-to-value ratio. So we're trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the how, so that this can truly be rolled out on a nationwide basis and help not just big companies but little ones, because the younger companies tend to be the ones who are really producing the jobs and are expanding the most rapidly.
Certainly get a feel for why Secretary Ross is at the table on workforce development. Dina, the private sector, to continue on that conversation, as we've mentioned so far, they've been the leaders so far in workforce development. As we look at making this a true initiative of the administration, what role will the private sector play in that?
Well, first of all, I think clearly defining some measurable goals in each of the initiatives. Having spent the last 10 years in the private sector, I'm having a little bit of whiplash coming back to government and remembering some of the inefficiencies and some of the difficulties. When Reed and Jared and Chris spoke to the president about taking on the IT challenge, you know, the minor thing of trying to modernize the IT of the U.S. government, the president nailed it by saying, "It sounds like a really hard thing to do that's going to help the next guy." And I think that's often why so many of these projects haven't been taken on. They require presidential leadership and capital and a real commitment to work with the private sector. And I think the private sector will push us in the right direction through the American Innovation Council to actually have measurable goals in each of these initiatives, as Leader McCarthy was laying out. When I was working with Kathy and Bob Steele and others in New York on the private sector initiatives we built, we really tried to think about our company at the time as a lab of innovation. The private sector can take riskier capital to build new models around job creation, economic development, whatever they may be, and actually have the rigor of a measurement system to see how this program worked and what it achieved. But it really is ultimately only government that can scale programs in a meaningful way. And I do think in this administration there is an incredible desire to have a real legacy around things that the private sector helped us achieve that we can really measure in an important way.
It's been interesting as we've started to study it. The same principles that are holding true in countries that have always favored apprenticeship programs are true here. They're just being driven by the private sector. When our private sector companies team with local community colleges, help them do the curriculum, put in place internship and apprenticeship programs at the private sector while they're doing the community college education, vocational education, they're achieving terrific results. People are not dropping out. They're on a pathway to a job, and they're good, high-wage jobs. So this is something that we, as an administration, can 100% get behind and amplify, and that's really, I think, our mission.
I think, Reed, on that
Please.
point, it's worth mentioning the task force that was formed with the private sector on exactly this topic. So obviously this will be informed by incredible academics and both government agencies and people working in in just across the private sector, but some of the programs that we've examined, and Ginny Romney from IBM is on our task force, and one of the incredible things she did at IBM was really work with a series of now over 40 public schools to ensure and creating an actual curriculum with those schools, the P-TECH schools. The first one was in Brooklyn, New York, actually, and to create a curriculum for these apprenticeships, for these students going through, and then IBM would hire the students on the other side. And this stemmed, and we heard it time and time again, whether it was from Andrew from Dow Chemical or Ginny from IBM, so many large organizations were looking to cultivate and really create in this next generation of graduating students the skills that they need to employ. So it's really happening already in a very robust and dynamic way in the private sector because of the need. Right now there are over 500,000 jobs that can't be filled because the students graduating don't have the skills that are relevant for those positions. So we want to bridge that gap. We want to take these programs and grow them in a very real and measurable way.
It's a great point. And one of the things we have to do as part of that is we have to rebrand vocational education. We need to make it something that is honored, as your father has said so often, that a skill needs to be honored. And fortunately, we have someone in Ivanka that knows a little bit about branding. You've also been a vocal person about the need to empower women in the workforce and in the workplace. Today is Equal Pay Day nationally. How will this workforce initiative support your goal of empowering women in the workplace?
Well, my father wants to create 25 million jobs in this country, and women need to fully participate for that to be realized and for that goal to be realized. Women are starting businesses at an enormously fast rate. We need to empower them and to fuel that growth. When we think about workforce development, and just one component of it, I was talking about earlier, STEM education, while 48% of today's workforce are women, only 24% of people in STEM fields are female. And when you think about where the jobs of the future are coming from, that's a very frightening statistic, and we're actually moving in the wrong direction. So over the course of a little over a decade, women's participation in science, engineering, math, and technology has actually slid from just around 30 to now in the low 20s, depending on which of those disciplines. So it's really important we think about the introduction of girls in STEM fields in our school system, making sure that they're really participating in these fields, because when we think about equal pay and the challenge we have to finally level the playing field, I think this will be a very important component when we think about the future to doing just that.
We talked about it in the first answer. This is going to be a holistic approach. And unfortunately and fortunately, all these topics we're talking about today are big topics. They take sustained effort in order to effectuate them properly. And you're talking about workforce, well, that starts in K-12, right? And then it leads into a vocational apprenticeship, and then it gets into retraining, as Ivanka was saying. These are big projects, big initiatives, but that's what this administration wants to take on. Let's go to the CEOs to get their input and ideas. So I think
Phillips over here. Just to pick up on the apprenticeship idea, we've tried that at Run a Technology Company in
Charles,
New York.
sorry, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And with CONY, it's actually worked pretty well, but it did take a lot of time, and this is where the federal government can help. So we gave the CONY our software. They built 2 courses around us, and when the kids graduate and get certified, we guarantee them a job with us or one of our customers. That's working well, but finding the professor who understands that, who wants to do that, understands it's okay for academia to partner with a commercial company, that took 2 or 3 years to find that person each university. And the second thing is just the funding. There has to be a computer infrastructure set up, somebody has to train the professors, curriculum has to be built, so it's not inexpensive, and that take another 2 or 3 years. And so the idea is great, but just need some way to scale it over time and then encourage you, because that's what happens in India and Manila. That's what they've been doing this for many years. If we could do that here, that shortage of talent that we have in technology, that's the way to address it.
And we've seen some of the most successful examples happening organically, just like you mentioned, where private sector needs at companies are being met through community colleges where they're collaborating locally, creating a curriculum that is mutually advantageous to the students graduating and to the companies who are prospective employers. So we're studying all those different efforts and looking to figure out how to scale it. I think Secretary Ross mentioned the role of digital, which is enormously important. Also the role of creating accreditation programs and really thinking about how to create both standards and certificates across different industries. And the construction industry in particular has done quite a good job on this front, and that's why so many of today's apprentices that you see are coming up through that industry. So taking some examples and bringing that to manufacturing and bringing that to technology.
Yeah, I'd like to challenge the people in this audience to come up with a better way to label vocational. Reed mentioned about branding. I think it needs rebranding in two dimensions. One is with the young people themselves, because vocational has taken on a pejorative meaning that I think is unnecessary. But the other is with the parents. Parents have a revulsion to the idea that their offspring might actually work with their hands or not work as after college. And I think we need to change both mindsets in order to get this program to really work for the young folks.
Ivanka, Secretary Ross, Dina, this is a big topic. We appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would encourage everyone in this room to try and create apprenticeship programs at their companies, because you can all really move the needle.
Now you have two challenges.
Yes.
Thank you. Great job.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you. Great job. It's now my great honor to introduce someone who's actually very, very familiar and has been a leader on all the issues that we've been talking about. In his 12 years in Congress and in his 4 years as the governor of Indiana, Mike Pence led the country in these issues, being modernizing of government and workforce development. He's also a man of incredible quality and honor. It is truly one of my great privileges to get to work with him. So please help me in welcoming the 48th Vice President of the United States, Mr. Mike Pence.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Reed. And how about another round of applause for that last panel? Ivanka and Dina and Wilbur. It's a great privilege to be able to welcome you to the White House. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone involved in the Partnership for New York City, Michael Corbett, Steven Schwartzman. It's an honor to have the leaders that are gathered in the room here with us today. I know the President is on his way over, and it's my great privilege this morning to share a few thoughts in the midst of this important conversation on the topics that you're covering before I introduce my friend and the 45th President of the United States. Let me say first and foremost, though, the companies represented in the Partnership for New York City are all American success stories. You have our admiration, you have our appreciation. Your businesses account for more than 7 million jobs, and you add over $1 trillion to our economy each and every year. What's more important is the people behind the numbers, and the topics that you've covered today are all about creating more jobs and more opportunities for Americans who are anxious to climb the ladder of success in the organizations that you represent and in companies all across this country. So first and foremost, on behalf of the President and the whole team that you've heard from this morning, and distinguished members of our Cabinet, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your leadership. I think as you will hear this morning in the dialogue that is about to commence, that America has elected a businessman as President of the United States, and he is committed to being the best friend business has ever had in the White House. We've already seen the results since literally when the election was called at I think it was about 4 in the morning that morning, wasn't it, Ivanka, that we were all together? Literally, we've seen renewed energy and dynamism in the American economy. The first 2 jobs reports, as I'm sure you are aware, thanks in no small part to the leadership represented in businesses here in the room today. The first 2 jobs reports show that under President Trump, nearly 500,000 new jobs have been created in the first 2 months of this year. Businesses and consumers haven't been this optimistic in decades. In fact, we just learned from the National Association of Manufacturers that in their historic quarterly report, 93% of manufacturers are optimistic about the future. That represented almost a 40-point increase in optimism since the last report. We think that is evidence of a vote of confidence in our new president and in his vision to get this economy moving again by putting common sense principles into practice. From the very outset of this administration, the president has been energetically working to roll back excessive regulation and red tape. Leaders in Congress, and I see Leader McCarthy, who's with us today, have been producing under what's known as the Congressional Review Act legislation to roll back onerous regulations that emerged in the waning days of the Obama administration. And in the coming days, President Trump will be signing even more bills into law, rolling back that avalanche of red tape. The president's also taken decisive executive action on expanding American energy, the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Pipeline. We continue to work earnestly with Congress for a new future on health care reform. And the President and I remain confident that working with the Congress, we will repeal and replace Obamacare with health care reform that will work for the American people and work for the American economy. And of course, in the offing before we reach the end of the year, the President is determined to roll his sleeves up, work with the Congress, and pass the largest tax reform in a generation. Business, as I said, from those numbers about optimism, business has clearly gotten the message. But today's conversation is all about learning from job creators represented in this room how we can continue to build on the momentum in this economy, particularly focusing on infrastructure, government modernization, and workforce. I can tell you that the subject that I came in at the end of, and I know was much a topic today with Ivanka and with Wilbur, having to do with improving the quality of our workforce, expanding opportunities for what is known as career and technical education, what we back in Indiana call vocational education, is a real passion for our new president. And we look forward to partnering with you in ways that we can continue to encourage investment and create opportunities for expanded career and vocational education. And so today is all about really giving you an opportunity to share your thoughts. It's part of an ongoing conversation this administration has commenced since the very first day the president took office, listening to business leaders, listening to everyday Americans about ways that we can bring about his agenda to make America great again and to have our economy growing and expanding in a way that is consistent with the most powerful economy in the history of the world. I think the president is in the side chamber, so let me say to all of you, the opportunity you have today is to hear from a man who I have a chance to sit with every day. What you're going to see firsthand is what I see each and every day, and that is not only just a businessman made president, but you're going to see a leader, informed, focused, decisive, and absolutely committed to make America great again. It is my high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to all of you my friend, the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
Thank you, Mike.
Good morning.
Sir, I know.
Hello, Ivanka.
I know you know a few of the people in this room.
I do. All the killers from New York. I'm looking at all those competitors, those great talents, great builders.
I have to give you a heads up that Ivanka chaired one of the sessions before this. Tough act to follow.
Oh, she's tough.
Yeah.
Very tough.
Vice President Pence listed some of the amazing accomplishments that have taken place since your election and your 75 days in office. The stock market has had almost unprecedented sustained growth. Unprecedented confidence from our manufacturing sector and other business sectors, leading to massive private sector investment and job growth. You have gotten rid of regulations that were unnecessary and were job stifling. You have strengthened our borders and strengthened our military. You've nominated a superb Supreme Court justice, amongst many other things. How does all that feel?
And we're getting unbelievable credit for what we've done, other than the mainstream media, which just gives us no credit whatsoever. Right. But we are getting tremendous credit. And if you look at the real estate industry, the mining industry, the farming industry, if you look at any of the major industries, you see what's going on. In fact, even today I was very happy, as I read this morning early, that our trade deficit with others has gone down very considerably in the last short period of time. It's having a big impact. And as you know, I'm meeting with the president of China on Thursday and Friday in Palm Beach, Florida. And I think we're going to have a very interesting talk. We're have a lot of respect for him. I've spoken to him numerous times. But we have to do better, because our deficit with China, as you know, $504 billion. That's a year.
That's incredible.
That's enough for a lifetime. Even Steve would say that. But that's a year. So we're going to have a great meeting. I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic meeting, and we're going to talk about a lot of things, including, of course, North Korea, a problem. And that's really a humanity problem. So we're going to be talking about that also.
You have made it a driving force of this administration to bring in the best minds we can from the private sector, to listen intently to them, and to take decisive action. How important is that, and how important is it to reform government to bridge the gap between the private and public sectors?
Well, I did. I brought you. I brought Gary Cohn. I brought a lot of very great people. My friend Steve is helping us out. We have a superstar committee of 22 people, and every time somebody calls me, I say, Steve, put them on. No, we want to keep it at this level. You know, the heads of the biggest companies, they all want to be in our committee, right, Stephen? But Steve likes to keep it very small. But they will go off and they'll disappear, and we'll put others on. But we've had some great meetings, and we've all learned a lot. One thing that did come up, and it came up yesterday, was Gary Cohn. Where's Gary? Is he here? Right there. Could you bring me that chart, please? Do you mind? Let me see that chart. So this was just something. This is sort of incredible. That's so beautiful. Yeah, no, you're not quite. This is to build a highway in the United States. Now, this was just done yesterday. I saw it for the first time. I said, you know, I'm speaking to some of my friends who are builders, really great builders. And they've gone through the process. We've all gone through it in New York. We call it the zoning process in New York. But you start up here, and this is anywhere from a 10 to a 20-year process. You have, 17 agencies? You have hundreds and hundreds of permits. Many of them are statutory, where you can't even apply for the second permit until 6 months go by. The process, so this is to build a highway. This is a simple highway. And these are the agencies. So it's 17 agencies. How many different steps is it?
DJ?
16 different approvals.
16?
29 different statutes, 5 different executive orders that all apply to this process. This is indicative, so this is not a specific project, but this is the type of process that a government, this is a state government, would have to go through to permit a highway federally. This is just federal, not state regulations.
So it can take anywhere from 10, if you're really good, 10 years to 20 years, and then they vote, and you lose. They don't want it. And it costs sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars just to go through the process. Thank you very much. That was a great job you did. Be careful. Don't fall. I don't want to have you fall. You'll be a big story in the paper if you go down. So I just saw that yesterday. Gary Cohn walked in and he showed it to me. And for no reason, I said, you have to do me a favor. But a lot of you're such pros, some of the best pros in the world sitting in this room. You understand it. It's a process. Now, I've always liked it because it gave people that could go through that process an advantage, like Jerry. But it gave us an advantage if you could get through the process. But getting a building approved in New York is a horrible, horrible thing. And that's nothing compared to when you get into the highways and the dams. They don't even talk about dams anymore. You know, hydropower is a great, great form of power. We don't even talk about it because to get the environmental permits are virtually impossible. It's one of the best things you can do, hydro, but we don't talk about it anymore. So we've come to a halt. We have a tremendous person that we put in charge of EPA, Scott Pruitt, who is an environmental person. He wants clean air, he wants clean water, but he doesn't think it takes you 26 years to get a permit to build a building and to have jobs, at which time those companies are usually gone out of business, et cetera. So we're really speeding up the process. We're going to try and take that process from a minimum of 10 years down to 1 year. I said, can't we make it 4 months? Can't we do it in 4 months? And there is a certain logic to that, but we'll be satisfied with a year, but it won't be any more than a year. So we have to build roads, we have to build highways. We're talking about a very major infrastructure bill of $1 trillion, perhaps even more. And when we have to do our jobs, I mean, if we say we're giving to New York City hundreds of millions of dollars to build a road someplace, it doesn't help if they can't start, because it's going to take 7.5 years to get the permits. Even to redo a road takes years to get the permits. You know, you have a road that's there, and you want to redo it, and you have to get new permits for the kind of asphalt you're using, the kind of concrete you may want to use. And if we're going to give all of this money, you know, there was a very large infrastructure bill that was approved during the Obama administration, $1 trillion. Nobody ever saw anything being built. I mean, to this day, I haven't heard of anything that's been built. They used most of that money, it went, and they used it on social programs. And we want this to be on infrastructure. I'm working with Steve Roth and with Richard Lefrak, two friends of mine that are very good builders. They're great builders. And they know how to get things done. They know how to cut red tape. Then we're going to give them the advantage of having what we have. I see Elaine is here, so we're so important, who is doing an incredible job, by the way, Secretary of Transportation. And Elaine will be working, but we're going to set up a committee headed by Steve and Richard, and we're going to cut a lot of red tape. But we don't want to send $1 billion to New York and find out 5 years later the money was never spent, because we're going to be very strong that it has to be spent on shovels, not on other programs. And in the last case, a lot of it was spent on other programs. But we're going to say, if you don't spend the money, if you don't start, if you have a job that you can't start within 90 days, we're not going to give you the money for it, because it doesn't help. It doesn't help us. And we're going to be very strong on that. They have to be able to start within 90 days.
Mr. President, we have some of the great business leaders in the country here. If okay with you, they have a few questions, if that's
sure.
Great.
Hello, Jerry. He didn't have to say his name. He was ready to say his name. We know. We know Jerry. Jerry Spire, everybody.
Mr. President, you're doing a great job, and we're all really grateful to you for the sacrifices you're making.
Okay.
Hope you heard that.
That sounds much better.
I think from New York's point of view, we send a lot of money into the economy. As a number of people have said, it's over $1 trillion. We're worried that we're going to have a problem with Congress. And
with the deductions, right?
well,
Deduction.
That too. But we're worried about various programs that help the city. The city's doing fine right now. Even the Yankees are doing fine. But what we're really concerned about is the future. Do you have any advice for us?
Well, look, I love New York. And, you know, in some ways, we're all lucky that I'm from New York, because New York has unique problems. So does Los Angeles, so does Chicago. You know, there are places that have unique problems. One of the problems that you have is debt and deductibility. That's a big one, because a lot of the states that don't have debt or have very little debt, like in the case of Mike Pence, where he did such a good job in Indiana, and it's a AAA rated bond, one of the strongest in the country. And, you know, deductibility is not that big of a deal because they don't have that much to deduct. And over here, you know, in New York, when you look at what's going on with us, we don't know in terms of the municipality and in terms of the state, we don't know if it can even make it if you don't have that. Are people going to buy? So it's a very big problem. And the problem I have is that there are many places throughout the country that are in the exact opposite position. And they consider that a gift to the state and a gift to the people. And we know New York does things that a lot of people don't read about. You know, you look at what the money that they contribute to our economy, to our country. And people don't know about that. They don't maybe want to know about that. So you do have, I call it a tale of two cities. You have different interests. But I am watching over everybody, Jerry. You're in good hands, okay? You're in good hands, believe me. You can tell the people of New York. Even though I didn't win New York State, I should have won New York State, but I didn't.
Mr. President, Kathy Engelbert with Deloitte. I want to return to a conversation we just had with Ivanka, Dean, and Wilbur on jobs, the workforce of the future. And so as we think about that and we think about our skill sets, in New York City alone, our public high school graduation rate is at 70%. But the readiness of our students for college and careers is only is assessed at 37%. So as we look at the pace of change, we look at the digital transformation we all see in business in the marketplace, and we look at the skills that this disconnect between what employers need and what our students coming into our workforces are prepared to deliver. It would be great to get your thoughts on the priorities of the administration around education, around, again, what I like to call not the future of work, but the work of the future, because the future of work sounds a little ominous, but the work of the future actually sounds pretty visionary. Right. So if you could give us those priorities and how readiness
Okay, so
is
before you sit, so you're giving me numbers from New York. You're a proud New Yorker, but you're giving me numbers. Why is it doing so badly? Tell me. Why are the numbers so horrific in terms of education, and what happens when somebody goes through school and then they can't read after they graduate from high school and they can barely read? So what's the answer?
Yeah, so first I would say that as we look at New York's made enormous progress in a decade. By the way, that 70% was 50%, so a 40% increase. So we're making enormous progress in making an impact.
See how quickly she's changing? See that, Billy?
Making enormous progress, but we're not done. We have a lot of work to do. And I think we talked earlier about public-private partnerships, apprenticeship models, which we have a beautiful apprenticeship model that works and brings them our next generation of leaders. So I do think there's a lot we can do through relooking at funding programs. We talked earlier about consolidating the many programs that are out there. We're all trying to make our individual impact, and we can make a huge impact together.
Sure, and I know you work very hard on it, and you have made progress. Charter schools are another thing that people are talking about a lot, and some of the charter schools in New York have been amazing. They've done incredibly well. People can't get in. I mean, you can't get in. It's been, I don't call it an experiment anymore. It's far beyond an experiment. If you look at so many elements of education, and it's so sad to see what's happening in the country. Even the numbers, as good, you'd say we're doing better, but the numbers in New York, the numbers in Chicago are very rough. The numbers in Los Angeles, the cities, it's a very rough situation. Common Core, I mean, we have to bring education more local. We can't be managing education from Washington. When I go out to Iowa, when I go out to the different states and I talk, they want to run their school programs locally. and they'll do a much better job than somebody. And look, these are some very good people in Washington, but you also have bureaucrats that make a lot of money and don't really care that much about what they're doing or about the community that they have never seen and they'll never meet and they never will see. And I like the fact of getting rid of Common Core. You know, Common Core to me is, we have to end it. We have to bring education local. To me, I've always said it. I've been saying it during the campaign, and we're doing it. Betsy DeVos is she's doing a terrific job, highly respected, tremendous track record. But she's got one of the toughest jobs of any of our secretaries. To me, she's got one of the toughest jobs. There's some pretty tough jobs out there, but she's got one of the toughest jobs. We're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of expertise. We're going to have great talent having to do with education, because there's nothing more important than education. And we've got to get those numbers in New York better. And I think they will be better. And a lot of people, a lot of the greatest people I know in New York, they're totally in love, including Ivanka and Jared. They're so much involved, and it's so important to them, the word education. And it's happening, and I see it happening in New York very much, but it's happening elsewhere too. I think we're going to have a great 4 years.
Mr. President, I know you have
prior to running again,
a pressing issue to deal with. Steve and Mike, I think, just wanted to thank you for attending today and maybe make a final comment on behalf of the round two.
Well, thanks a lot for being here, and thanks for everybody for being here. It's been a really interesting day, and you've had everybody of importance at the event. I think it's terrific in terms of the stuff you're trying to do to modernize the government, educate, and so forth. And I think we have to keep a focus on that, because the outside world doesn't always get the message that that's really what's going on, because you're doing profound things. You're taking on enormous embedded issues. And I think with a kind of effort that can be marshaled, you can do amazing things. And that's on behalf of Mike Corbett and myself, who chair the partnership. It's sort of a trust, gets rotated from person to person every 2 years. I want to wish you really good luck with the Chinese. That's an important thing, as we all know. And I think there's a real opportunity to make progress with them. And you should have a good time in Florida. I hope the weather's good.
Yeah, the weather will be beautiful. Thank you, Steve. I just want to finish by saying that we are absolutely destroying these horrible regulations that have been placed on your heads over not 8 years, over the last 20 and 25 years. You have regulations that are horrendous. Dodd-Frank is an example of what we're working on, and we're working on it right now. We're going to be coming out with some very strong, not far beyond recommendations. We're going to be doing things that are going to be very good for the banking industry so that the banks can loan money to people that need it. I speak to people all the time. They used to borrow money from banks to open up. There was one in Nevada where to open up a pizza shop. He had 3 shops. He had a bank. And he said, you know, at that time he called me Mr. Trump because I hadn't won yet. But he said, Mr. Trump, I can't open up anything. I can't do anything. The banks don't even. I had a bank for 20 years. Now they don't even take my phone call. And I was always a very good customer. So I haven't been able to do what I do. They can't do it. I mean, the banks got so restricted. And I've always said, and some people get insulted, but, you know, it's not necessarily the man that's making a lot of money that's running the bank. You look at the folks from government that are running all over the banks, they're running the banks. And the people that are really, you know, the head people, they're petrified of the regulators. They're petrified. They can't move. The regulators are running the banks. So we're going to do a very major haircut on Dodd-Frank. We want strong restrictions. We want strong regulation, but not regulation that makes it impossible for the banks to loan to people that are going to create jobs. But we're doing, that's just one example. We're doing so many cuts on regulations, and we have a book on regulations, and if you add them all up, it goes up to the ceiling 3 times over. It's just one after another after another. It's just like that chart. I thought that chart was so descriptive. And every industry is just like that chart. And that's to build a simple roadway or highway. That's what you have to go through. And we're going to be able to get rid of 95% of that and still have the same kind of protection. And we want safety, and we want environmental protection. I mean, I've won awards on environmental protection. I'm a big believer, believe it or not. But we want that kind of protection. We want clean air, and we want clean water. But we shouldn't have to get the approvals from 16 different agencies for almost the same thing. So we have a country with tremendous potential. We have the greatest people on earth, but we have to use that potential, and we have to let those people do their thing. And with that, I just want to thank you all. I think you're going to see a very much different environment than you've been used to over the last, again, 20, 25 years. We're going to unleash the country, and I'm willing to take the heat, and that's okay. I've been taking heat my whole life. But in the end, I know it's the right thing to do, and we're going to create a lot of jobs. We have 100 million people, if you look. You know, the real number is not 4.6%. They told me I had 4.6% last month. I'm doing great. I said, yeah, but what about the 100 million people? A lot of those people came out and voted for me. I call them the forgotten man, the forgotten woman. But a lot of those people, a good percentage of them would like to have jobs, and they don't. You know, one of the statistics that to me is just ridiculous. So the 4.6 sounds good, but when you look for a job, you can't find it, and you give up, you are now considered statistically employed. But I don't consider those people employed. If you look at what's happened with Ford and with General Motors and with Fiat Chrysler and so many other car companies, you see what they're doing back in Michigan and Ohio. They were leaving. They were going to Mexico and many other places. They're now staying here. Now, I did say, Reed knows this very well because you've seen me say it many times to the big auto companies at meetings, it's okay. Enjoy your new plant. Please send me a picture. I'm sure it's going to be lovely. But when you make your car or when you make your air conditioner and you think you're going to fire all of our workers and open up a new place in another country, and you're going to come through our what will be a very strong border, which is already, you see what's happened, 61% down now in terms of illegal people coming in. Way down in terms of drugs pouring into our country and poisoning our youth. Way down. General Kelly's done a great job. But when you think you're going to sell that car or that air conditioner through our border, it's not going to happen. You're going to have a tax, and the tax may be 35%. And you know what? Every single major company that I've had that conversation with has said, you know, we've decided to stay in the United States. It's amazing. And you would have thought they would have said this, frankly, for years, but nobody's ever said it. And we've lost close to 70,000 factories over a relatively short period of time. 70,000. You wouldn't believe it's possible, Reed, to lose 70,000 factories. 70,000. You know, you look at a map of the United States, how many factories can you lose? We lost almost 70,000 factories. And I will tell you, that's not happening because now they're all staying here and they're all expanding here. Ford announced last week a massive expansion of 3 of its plants. That was not going to happen, believe me, if I didn't win. So good luck, everybody. Enjoy yourselves. You're my friends. You're amazing people, and we're going to put you to work. Thank you.